The November rain fell like bullets against the windshield as Sarah Martinez pressed her face to the cold glass of the Greyhound bus. Her breath fogged the window, obscuring the endless stretch of Montana highway that disappeared into darkness ahead. At 19, with nothing but a torn duffel bag and $43 in her pocket, she was running toward a future she couldn't see and away from a past that had shattered like glass. Her hand moved instinctively to her swollen belly, 5 months along and showing now in ways her loose sweater couldn't hide. The baby kicked, a flutter that reminded her she wasn't just carrying her own broken dreams anymore. She was carrying someone else's entire future. The bus wheezed to a stop at Millfield Junction, population 847, according to the faded sign barely visible through the storm. Sarah hadn't planned to get off here. She hadn't planned much of anything since that terrible morning 3 weeks ago when her father's words still echoed in her mind like a curse she couldn't shake. But sometimes life doesn't ask what you've planned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, the Martinez family home in Bakersfield had buzzed with the familiar chaos of Sunday morning. The smell of chorizo and eggs drifted from the kitchen where Maria Martinez moved with practiced efficiency, her voice cutting through the clatter of plates as she called her children to breakfast. "Sarah! Miguel, breakfast is getting cold." Sarah stood in her childhood bedroom, staring at the pregnancy test she'd taken for the 3rd time, hoping somehow the result would change. The 2 pink lines stared back at her, unwavering in their certainty. Her hands trembled as she set it, down on the dresser next to the acceptance letter from UC Berkeley that had arrived just 2 months ago, the letter that had made her father prouder than she'd ever seen. Him. She was supposed to be the first Martinez to graduate college, the one who would break the cycle of struggle that had defined their family for generations. Her father, Roberto, had worked double shifts at the packaging plant for years, saving every penny he could spare for her education. Her mother had cleaned houses on weekends, her knees permanently stained from scrubbing other people's floors. Also, Sarah could have the future they'd never had. Now, standing in front of her mirror, Sarah saw all those dreams crumbling. The girl looking back at her wasn't the honor student who had graduated valedictorian. She wasn't the daughter who was going to make everything worthwhile. She was just another statistic, another teenage mother who had thrown her life away. The father of the baby was Marcus Chen, a boy she'd met at a summer job at the local bookstore. He was smart, funny, and planning to attend Stanford in the fall. They'd spent lazy afternoons talking about books and dreams, stolen evenings walking through the park, and one night in July, when the heat made everything feel possible and consequences seemed like something that happened to other people. When she told Marcus about the pregnancy 2 weeks ago, his face had gone pale as winter. He'd stammered about his future, about Stanford, about how they were both too young. He'd offered to help pay for taking care of it, but when Sarah said she couldn't go through with that, he'd simply disappeared. Blocked her number, avoided the places they used to meet, vanished from her life as if their summer together had been nothing more than a mirage. Sarah touched her belly again, feeling the slight firmness that would soon become impossible to hide. She'd thrown up every morning for the past month, blaming it on stress when her mother asked. She'd started wearing looser clothes, avoided family gatherings where the aunties might notice changes, lived in a bubble of denial that was about to burst. The sound of her father's work boots on the hardwood floor told her breakfast was over, and he was heading to the living room for his Sunday ritual of reading the paper and watching the morning news. Roberto Martinez was a man of few words but strong convictions. He believed in hard work, family honor, and the idea that children should be better than their parents. Sarah had always been his shining example of how sacrifice could pay off. She took a deep breath, slipped the pregnancy test into her pocket, and walked downstairs. The living room smelled of coffee and the aftershave her father wore to church. Roberto sat in his favorite chair, a threadbare recliner that had been old when they bought it at a garage sale 15 years ago. The Sunday paper was spread across his lap, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied the job listings, a habit he'd never broken, even though he'd held the same position for over a decade. "Papa," Sarah said, her voice smaller than she'd intended. He looked up, and for a moment, his face lit up with the warm smile he reserved just for her. "Mika, come sit. I was just reading about the scholarship opportunities at Berkeley. Did you know they have a program for students who want to study abroad? Imagine that, my daughter studying in Europe." The excitement in his voice made Sarah's chest tighten. She perched on the edge of the couch, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Papa, I need to tell you something." Something in her tone must have warned him, because his smile faded slightly. He folded the paper and set it aside, giving her his complete attention in the way that had always made her feel like the most important person in the world. "What is it, Mika?" Sarah pulled the pregnancy test from her pocket with shaking hands. She didn't say anything, couldn't say anything, just held it out to him like an offering of destruction. Roberto's eyes fixed on the small plastic stick, and Sarah watched as understanding dawned on his face like a slow-motion catastrophe. The color drained from his cheeks. His mouth opened, closed, opened again without sound. Finally, in a voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it, he asked, "How long?" "5 months," she whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. From the kitchen came the sound of her mother humming as she washed dishes, blissfully unaware that her world was about to shatter. Her younger brother Miguel was upstairs, probably playing video games. Still living in the innocence Sarah had lost somewhere between July and now, Roberto stood up slowly, like an old man, though he was only 45. He walked to the window that looked out over their small backyard, where the lemon tree he'd planted when Sarah was born still produced fruit every year. "Who?" he asked without turning around. "Marcus Chen, from the bookstore, the Chinese boy." Sarah nodded, then realized he couldn't see her. "Yes, and he knows." "Yes. What does he plan to do?" Sarah's throat closed. "He's going to Stanford. He doesn't want to be involved." Roberto's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Sarah thought he might punch the window. Instead, he just stood there, staring out at the tree that had grown alongside his daughter, both of them reaching toward dreams that suddenly seemed impossibly far away. When he finally turned around, his face was a mask Sarah had never seen before. Cold, distant, carved from stone. "Get out!" The words hit her like physical blows. "Papa, get out!" His voice exploded through the house, bringing footsteps running from the kitchen and upstairs. "You want to throw your life away? You want to destroy everything we worked for? Fine, but you don't do it under my roof." Maria Martinez appeared in the doorway, dish towel in her hands, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Roberto, what's happening? What's wrong?" Roberto's voice was deadly quiet now. "Ask your daughter. Ask her what she's done to our family." Sarah looked at her mother, saw the moment understanding dawned on Maria's face too. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, and tears sprang to her eyes, but not tears of anger. Tears of sorrow, of loss, of a future she could see crumbling just as clearly as her husband could. "Mija," Maria whispered, reaching toward Sarah. "Don't." Roberto's voice cut like a blade. She made her choice. Now she can live with it. Miguel appeared at the top of the stairs, 16 and confused, still in his pajamas. "What's going on?" "Your sister is pregnant," Roberto said, not taking his eyes off Sarah, "and she's leaving." The house went dead silent except for the sound of Sarah's heart breaking. She looked around at the faces of her family, her father's cold fury, her mother's devastated tears, her brother's shocked confusion, and realized this was the last time she would stand in this room as someone's daughter. "I need my things," she said. "You have 10 minutes, Roberto replied. "Then I never want to see you again." Sarah climbed the stairs on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. Behind her, she could hear her mother's quiet sobs and her father's harsh whispers. Miguel followed her to her room, hovering in the doorway as she pulled her duffel bag from the closet. "Sarah, what are you going to do?" he asked, his voice cracking with the beginning of tears. She threw clothes into the bag without looking at them, her movements mechanical. "I don't know. You could come back, right? After the baby?" Sarah paused, holding a sweater she'd gotten for Christmas. Would she? Could she? Or had her father's words carved a permanent canyon between her and the only home she'd ever known? "I don't know," she said again, because it was the only honest answer she had. When she came back downstairs, her mother was sitting at the kitchen table, crying into her hands. Roberto stood by the front door, car keys in his hand. "I'll drive you to the bus station," he said, not looking at her. The ride through Bakersfield was the longest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. They passed all the landmarks of her childhood: the elementary school, where she'd learned to read; the park where her father had taught her to ride a bike; the church where she'd been confirmed just 2 years ago. Each familiar sight felt like a goodbye. At the Greyhound station, Roberto pulled money from his wallet, more than Sarah had expected, enough for a ticket and a few meals. He handed it to her without meeting her eyes. "This is the last help you'll get from me," he said. Sarah took the money, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. His hand was rough from years of manual labor, warm and familiar, and she wanted to hold on to it forever. "Papa, I'm sorry," she whispered. For just a second his mask slipped, and she saw the man who had read her bedtime stories and cheered at her graduation. But then the coldness returned. "So am I," he said. "Sorry I raised a daughter who would throw her life away for some boy who doesn't even want her." Those words followed Sarah onto the bus, through 3 transfers and 2 sleepless nights, all the way to a rain-soaked bus stop in Millfield, Montana, where she stood with her duffel bag and her broken heart, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The rain plastered her hair to her head as she looked around the tiny town. There was a diner across the street, with a neon sign that flickered between open and OPN. A few pickup trucks were parked outside, and warm light spilled from the windows, making it look like the most welcoming place in the world. Sarah picked up her bag and walked toward it, each step taking her further from the girl she used to be and closer to whoever she was about to become. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if sensing they were about to start a new chapter. She had no way of knowing that in less than an hour she would meet a man whose loneliness matched her own, whose broken dreams would align with hers in ways that would change both their lives forever. She had no way of knowing that walking into Millie's diner on that rainy November night would be the first step toward finding something she'd never expected to find again. Hope. But first, she had to survive the storm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bell above Millie's diner door chimed as Sarah stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the worn linoleum floor. The warmth hit her like a physical embrace, and for a moment she just stood there, letting the heat seep into her chilled bones while her eyes adjusted to the fluorescent lighting. The diner was exactly what she'd expected: red vinyl booths with duct-taped tiers, a long counter with rotating stools, and the comforting smell of coffee and bacon grease that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. A handful of locals occupied the scattered tables, their conversations creating a low hum that felt like the heartbeat of a small town. "Honey, you're soaked to the bone." A woman in her 60s emerged from behind the counter, grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a uniform that had seen better decades. Her name tag read Millie, and her eyes held the kind of warmth that made strangers feel like family. "Come on, sit yourself down. Let me get you some coffee and a towel." Sarah chose a booth near the back, sliding her duffel bag onto the cracked vinyl seat across from her. The baby seemed to approve of the warmth, settling into a calmer rhythm that allowed Sarah to breathe properly for the first time in hours. Millie appeared with a steaming mug and a clean kitchen towel, studying Sarah with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize trouble when it walked through her door. "You look like you've had a rough go of it, sweetheart. Where you headed?" "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly, wrapping her hands around the mug and letting the heat spread through her fingers. "I just got off the bus from California. California's a long way from Millfield." Millie settled into the booth across from her without invitation, the kind of friendly intrusion that only worked in small towns. "You got family here?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't really have family anywhere right now." Something in her voice must have told Millie not to push, because the older woman simply nodded and patted Sarah's hand. "Well, everyone needs a place to land sometimes. You hungry? I make a mean grilled cheese, and you look like you could use some food in you." Before Sarah could answer, the diner's bell chimed again, bringing with it a gust of cold air and a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. His work shirt was damp from the rain, and mud caked his boots despite the mat by the door. "Evening, Thomas," Millie called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Usual spot?" The man, Thomas, nodded and headed for the counter, but his gaze caught Sarah's for just a moment. She saw something flicker in his expression, a recognition not of her specifically, but of the kind of lost desperation she was trying so hard to hide. Thomas Brennan had been coming to Millie's 3 nights a week for the past 2 years, ever since his world had collapsed in on itself like a house of cards in a hurricane. The routine had become his anchor: finish the evening chores, drive the 20 minutes into town, sit at the far end of the counter, and eat Millie's meatloaf while trying not to think about the empty house waiting for him back on the ranch. He'd grown up on the Brennan Ranch, 5,000 acres of prime Montana cattle land that had been in his family for 4 generations. As a boy, he'd dreamed of expanding the operation, maybe raising horses alongside the cattle, building something that would last another 100 years. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Rebecca Walsh, when they were both 22, and together they'd planned a life filled with children and laughter and the kind of deep contentment that came from working land you loved. But life, Thomas had learned, didn't much care about plans. Rebecca had wanted children from the day they married. She turned their spare bedroom into a nursery when she was 24, painting the walls a soft yellow and filling the space with stuffed animals and picture books. Month after month, year after year, they'd hoped and tried and prayed. The doctors had run tests, suggested treatments, offered possibilities that came with no guarantees and price tags that made Thomas wince. The miscarriages had started when Rebecca was 27, 3 of them in 2 years, each one stealing a little more light from her eyes, each one driving a wedge deeper into their marriage. Thomas had tried to be strong for both of them, working longer hours to pay for fertility treatments, holding Rebecca while she cried, telling her it would happen when God wanted it to happen. But God, it seemed, had other plans. The final miscarriage had happened on a February morning when the snow was 3 feet deep and the nearest hospital was 40 miles away. Thomas had driven through the storm with Rebecca bleeding in the passenger seat, her face pale as the snow outside. Both of them knowing they were losing more than another baby. They were losing each other. The doctor had been kind, but direct. More pregnancies would be dangerous, possibly fatal. The dream of children, of carrying on the Brennan legacy, was over. Rebecca had lasted 6 more months before the emptiness consumed her completely. Thomas had come home from checking the north pasture one evening in August to find a note on the kitchen table and her wedding ring beside it. She'd driven to Billings, she'd written, to stay with her sister. She needed time to figure out who she was, if she wasn't going to be a mother. The divorce papers had arrived 3 weeks later. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of Thomas rattling around in a house built for a family. 2 years of walking past the yellow nursery that he couldn't bring himself to repaint. 2 years of wondering if the land he loved was worth the loneliness that came with it. Now, sitting at Millie's counter with his coffee cooling in front of him, Thomas found his attention drifting to the young woman in the back booth. She couldn't be more than 19 or 20, with long dark hair and eyes that held the kind of pain he recognized. But there was something else about her, something that made him look twice. She was pregnant. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Not obviously so. She was wearing a loose sweater and sitting in a way that partially concealed her condition. But Thomas had spent enough years watching cattle to recognize the signs. The way she held herself, the protective curve of her arm around her middle, the careful way she moved. Here was everything he and Rebecca had wanted and couldn't have. Sitting alone in a diner in the middle of a rainstorm with nowhere to go. "Thomas?" Millie's voice broke through his thoughts. "You feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." He blinked, focusing on the older woman's concerned face. "Sorry, just tired." Millie glanced back at Sarah, then at Thomas. And something shifted in her expression. The look of a woman who had spent 40 years reading people and situations, who could spot a solution before the problem had even been fully defined. "You know," Millie said, wiping down the counter with unnecessary vigor, "that girl back there is in a tough spot. Just arrived from California with nothing but a bus ticket and the clothes on her back. Says she doesn't have anywhere to go." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "That's rough." Millie refilled his coffee without being asked. "Seems like a sweet kid. Polite, quiet, the kind who's had to grow up too fast, if you know what I mean." Thomas did know what she meant. He'd seen it in the mirror every morning for the past 2 years. The look of someone who'd had their future rearranged without their permission. Course. "Winter's coming," Millie continued, her tone carefully casual. "Be hard for a young woman in her condition to find work around here. Most of the seasonal jobs are already filled, and the permanent ones, well, they're looking for people who can stick around long-term." Her condition. So Millie had noticed too. Thomas found himself studying Sarah more carefully. She was beautiful in an understated way, with delicate features and skin that suggested Hispanic heritage. But it was her hands that caught his attention, the way she cradled her coffee mug, the gentle way she touched her belly when she thought no one was looking. There was love there, fierce and protective. The kind he'd seen in Rebecca's eyes during those brief, precious months when hope had outweighed disappointment. "She seems like she'd be a hard worker," Thomas heard himself say. Millie's eyes sharpened with interest. "I imagine she would be. Probably knows her way around a kitchen too. Lot of these young women do." The ranch house had been echoing empty for 2 years now. Thomas did his own cooking, his own cleaning, his own everything, because hiring help meant admitting that Rebecca wasn't coming back, that the life they'd planned was truly over. But lately, the silence had become deafening. He'd started leaving the radio on just to have voices in the house, had begun talking to his dogs like they were people. More than that, though, was the practical reality Millie had pointed out. Winter was coming, and Millfield wasn't exactly a land of opportunity for a pregnant teenager with no resources. The closest city was 3 hours away, and even there, jobs were scarce for someone in Sarah's situation. Thomas made a decision that surprised him with its suddenness. He stood up, left money on the counter for his untouched meal, and walked over to Sarah's booth. She looked up as he approached, wariness flickering in her dark eyes. "Excuse me," he said, suddenly aware of how awkward this was going to sound. "I couldn't help but overhear." "You're looking for work?" Sarah glanced past him to Millie, who was pretending to clean glasses while obviously listening to every word. Yes, I am. I'm Thomas Brennan. I run a cattle ranch about 20 miles outside town. I could use some help around the house, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. It's not glamorous work, but it comes with room and board, and the pay's fair." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas could practically see the wheels turning in her head. Here was a stranger offering her exactly what she needed most: a job, a place to stay, a chance to figure out what came next. But he was also a man she'd never met, in a town she'd never been to, and she was young and alone and vulnerable. "I don't know anything about ranch life," she said finally. "That's okay. I don't know anything about having a housekeeper." The words came out before he could stop them, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks. "What I mean is, we'd both be learning as we go." Sarah's hand moved to her belly, and Thomas saw the moment she made her decision. Maybe it was desperation, Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just the practical recognition that she didn't have a lot of other options. "When would I start?" she asked. "Tonight, if you want. The storm's getting worse, and you shouldn't be trying to find a motel in this weather." From behind the counter, Millie beamed like she'd just orchestrated the most successful matchmaking coup in Millfield history. "Well, isn't that something? Thomas, you be sure to show her the guest room upstairs. It's got its own bathroom and everything." Thomas nodded, suddenly wondering what the hell he'd just gotten himself into. 2 hours ago, he'd been planning to go home to his empty house and his frozen dinner and his solitary evening routine. Now he was offering to share that house with a pregnant stranger who might be running from something or someone, or just running toward a future that looked less bleak than the one she'd left behind. Sarah gathered her things, moving carefully, and Thomas found himself reaching for her duffel bag without thinking about it. She looked surprised, but didn't protest, following him toward the door. "You take care of that girl, Thomas Brennan," Millie called after them. "And Sarah, honey, don't let him work you too hard. He's been living like a hermit for too long." The ride to the ranch was quiet, except for the steady drum of rain on the truck's roof. Thomas kept glancing at Sarah out of the corner of his eye, wondering what her story was, why she'd ended up alone and pregnant in a bus station in Montana. Sarah stared out the passenger window at the darkness beyond, probably wondering the same things about him. Neither of them spoke about the enormous leap of faith they were both taking, he in bringing a stranger into his home, she in trusting a man she'd just met to provide shelter and safety for herself and her unborn child. But sometimes, when two people have been broken by life in similar ways, they recognize something in each other that transcends logic or caution. Sometimes the risk of trusting is smaller than the certainty of remaining alone. As they drove through the storm toward the Brennan Ranch, neither Thomas nor Sarah could have imagined how completely this one decision would change both of their lives. They couldn't have known that within weeks. The empty house would feel like home again, or that the child Sarah carried would become the answer to prayers Thomas had stopped praying. All they knew was that for the first time in months, neither of them would be spending the night alone, and for now, that was enough. The headlights of Thomas's pickup truck swept across the ranch house as they pulled into the gravel driveway, illuminating a 2-story farmhouse that looked like it had been built to weather any storm. White-clapboard siding, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs, and tall windows that would let in plenty of light during the day. It was the kind of house Sarah had only seen in movies about perfect American families. But as they got closer, she could see the small signs of neglect that spoke of a man living alone, gutters that needed cleaning, paint that was starting to peel around the window frames, flower boxes that sat empty and forgotten. The house was beautiful but lonely, like its owner. Thomas killed the engine and sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel. Sarah sensed his hesitation and wondered if he was already regretting his impulsive offer. She wouldn't blame him if he was. What did either of them really know about the other? She could be a criminal, a drug addict, someone running from dangerous people. And he could be. Well, she tried not to think about what he could be. "Second thoughts?" she asked quietly. Thomas turned to look at her, rain droplets still clinging to his hair from their dash to the truck. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Asked you first." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Fair enough. No, I'm not having second thoughts." "Are you?" Sarah looked at the house again, at the warm light spilling from the windows, and felt something inside her chest unclench for the first time in weeks. "No, I'm not." They made a run for the front porch through the rain, Sarah clutching her duffel bag while Thomas fumbled with his keys. The porch was deeper than it had looked from the truck, with enough room for several chairs and a swing that swayed gently in the wind. Sarah could imagine sitting here on summer evenings, watching the sun set over the pastures, feeling safe and settled. The thought surprised her with its intensity. She'd been homeless for less than a day, but already the idea of having a place to belong felt like oxygen after drowning. "Here we go," Thomas said, pushing open the front door and reaching for a light switch. The interior of the house was even more beautiful than the exterior. Hardwood floors stretched through an open living area where a massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. The furniture was masculine but comfortable. Leather couches, sturdy wooden tables, bookcases filled with what looked like actual books rather than decorations. Everything was clean and well maintained, but there was an emptiness to it. Like a stage set waiting for actors to bring it to life. "It's beautiful," Sarah said. "And meant it." Thomas shrugged, suddenly awkward again. "It's too big for one person, but it's been in my family for 4 generations. Hard to give up, you know." Sarah did know. She thought of the little house in Bakersfield, with its worn linoleum and hand-me-down furniture. It hadn't been much, but it had been home until 3 weeks ago. 2 golden retrievers appeared from somewhere in the back of the house, tails wagging enthusiastically as they investigated the newcomer. Thomas's whole demeanor changed when he saw them, his face softening in a way that made him look years younger. "That's Duke," he said, pointing to the larger of the 2 dogs, "and that's Dolly. They're harmless. But if they bother you—" "They're perfect," Sarah interrupted, kneeling down despite her awkwardness to let the dogs sniff her hands. Duke immediately began trying to lick her face, while Dolly pressed against her side with the kind of unconditional acceptance Sarah had been craving. Thomas watched her with the dogs, something unreadable in his expression. "They don't usually warm up to strangers that quickly. Animals are good judges of character," Sarah said, scratching behind Dolly's ears. "At least that's what my grandmother used to say." "Smart woman." Thomas picked up Sarah's duffel bag. "Come on, I'll show you your room." He led her up a staircase lined with family photos, 4 generations of Brennan men standing in front of barns and cattle, their faces serious and proud. Sarah caught glimpses of wedding photos, baby pictures, graduation shots, the visual history of a family that had deep roots in this place. At the top of the stairs, Thomas paused in front of a closed door, his hand on the knob. For a moment he looked like he might say something, but then he just opened the door to reveal a small but comfortable bedroom with its own adjoining bathroom. "This was supposed to be—" he started, then stopped. "It's yours for as long as you need it." Sarah stepped inside, taking in the pale blue walls, the white furniture, the rocking chair by the window. It was clearly a guest room, but there was something about it that felt different, more personal somehow. A mobile hung from the ceiling, with tiny wooden animals that would catch the light from the window. A bookshelf held children's stories alongside decorating magazines. The rocking chair had a small pillow embroidered with baby ducks. Understanding hit her like a gentle wave. This had been intended as a nursery. She turned to look at Thomas, who was staring at the mobile with an expression that was equal parts pain and longing. The pieces of his story began falling into place. The too big house, the loneliness, the way his eyes had lingered on her pregnant belly at the diner. "Thomas," she said softly. He blinked and seemed to come back to himself. "Bathroom's through there. Towels are in the closet. I'll be downstairs if you need anything." He was gone before she could respond, leaving Sarah alone in a room that held someone else's broken dreams. She sat down heavily in the rocking chair, her hand moving automatically to her belly as the baby stirred. The mobile spun slowly above her head, casting gentle shadows on the walls. She'd thought her situation was unique. The pregnant girl with nowhere to go, rejected by her family, facing an uncertain future. But now she was beginning to understand that everyone carried their own version of loss. Thomas's was just quieter, more hidden, worn smooth by 2 years of trying to pretend it didn't hurt anymore. Downstairs, she could hear him moving around the kitchen. The soft murmur of his voice as he talked to the dogs. The sounds of a man going through his evening routine, except tonight he wasn't alone. Tonight, for the first time in months, someone else was in his house. Sarah unpacked her few belongings, hanging her clothes in a closet that was far too big for what she owned. Her entire life fit into 3 drawers of a 6-drawer dresser. The baby clothes she'd started buying tiny. Onesies and soft blankets looked lost on the empty shelves she was folding. her last shirt when a soft knock came at the door. "Come in," she called. Thomas appeared with a glass of milk and a plate of sandwiches. "Figured you might be hungry. It's just turkey and cheese, but it's perfect." "Thank you." Sarah accepted the plate gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since the bus station in Denver. "You don't have to wait on me, you know. That's supposed to be my job. We'll figure out the details tomorrow. Tonight you just need to rest." He turned to go, then paused in the doorway.
"Sarah, can I ask?"
"Is there anyone who's going to be looking for you? Anyone who might cause trouble?" The question was carefully neutral, but Sarah heard the concern underneath it. He was wondering if he'd brought danger into his home, if there were angry boyfriends or worried parents who might show up demanding answers. "No," she said simply. "There's no one looking for me." The sadness in her voice must have told him everything he needed to know, because he just nodded. "Well, there's someone here now. You're not alone anymore." After he left, Sarah ate her sandwich and drank her milk while sitting in the rocking chair, looking out at the rain-soaked pastures visible through her window. Somewhere out there were cattle and horses, barns and fences, all the infrastructure of a working ranch. Tomorrow she would learn about this new world, figure out how to be useful, how to earn her place. But tonight she was warm and dry and safe. The baby seemed to sense her relief, settling into a peaceful calm that allowed Sarah to relax for the first time in weeks. She was just finishing her milk when her phone buzzed with a text message. For a wild moment she thought it might be her father, that maybe he'd had time to think and regret his harsh words. But the number was unfamiliar. "Is this Sarah Martinez?" "This is Father Miguel from St. Joseph's. Your mother asked me to reach out. She's very worried about you." Sarah stared at the message for a long time, her heart pounding. Her mother had given her number to their parish priest. Maria Martinez, who never went against her husband's wishes, had found a way to check on her daughter without directly defying Roberto's order to cut contact. She typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on, "I'm safe. I found work and a place to stay. Tell her not to worry." The response came quickly. "She wants you to know she loves you. She's praying for you and the baby every day." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she typed back, "Tell her I love her too, and that I'm sorry she knows, Mia. God knows too. You're not as alone as you think." Sarah set the phone aside and let herself cry for the family she'd lost, for the father who couldn't forgive her, for the mother who was loving her from a distance. But mixed in with the grief was something else, gratitude. She was hundreds of miles from home, living in a stranger's house, but she wasn't completely alone. Her mother's love was still reaching for her across the divide Roberto had created. And downstairs, a man who understood loss was probably lying awake too, wondering what he'd gotten himself into, wondering if maybe, just maybe, this unexpected arrangement might heal something in both of them. The rain continued to fall against the windows, but inside the old farmhouse, two broken people were taking the first tentative steps towards something that might eventually feel like family. Sarah fell asleep in the rocking chair, one hand on her belly, the other clutching her phone with her mother's message of love. She dreamed of yellow nurseries and lemon trees, of a father who might someday forgive her, and a baby who would grow up knowing it was wanted. And in the master bedroom down the hall, Thomas Brennan lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of someone else breathing in his house, wondering if he dared to hope that his long winter of loneliness might finally be coming to an end. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, two people who had thought they were finished with hope were beginning to discover that sometimes the most unexpected arrangements could become the most necessary. And the rain that had brought them together was washing away more than just the dust of autumn. It was washing away the assumption that their stories were over, that healing was impossible, that family could only be defined by blood. In the morning, there would be practical things to discuss, work schedules and responsibilities, boundaries and expectations. There would be the careful dance of two strangers learning to share space, to trust each other with their histories and their hopes. But tonight, for the first time in months, neither of them was facing their fears alone, and that was enough to dream on. Sarah woke to the sound of a diesel engine rumbling to life somewhere outside her window. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented by the pale morning light streaming through curtains she didn't remember hanging. Then it all came flooding back. The bus ride, the diner, Thomas Brennan, and his offer of work and shelter. She sat up carefully, her hand automatically going to her belly as the baby stirred awake with her. 22 weeks now and getting harder to hide. Soon she'd need maternity clothes, though she had no idea how she'd afford them on whatever wages Thomas planned to pay her. The digital clock on the nightstand read 5:47 a.m. Through the window, she could see Thomas loading hay bales onto the back of a pickup truck, his movements efficient and practiced in the pre-dawn cold. Duke and Dolly supervised from the porch, their golden coats catching the light from the barn's overhead fixture. Sarah had never lived on a ranch, had barely been outside of Bakersfield except for school field trips. But even she knew that cattle needed to be fed regardless of the weather or how little sleep their owner had gotten. Thomas probably started every day this early, summer or winter, sick or well, alone or with a pregnant stranger sleeping in his guest room. The thought made her feel guilty for lying in bed while he worked. She'd promised to earn her keep, and that meant pulling her weight from day one. She dressed quickly in jeans that were getting tight around the waist and one of her looser sweaters, then made her way downstairs. The kitchen was exactly what she'd expected from a ranch house, large, functional, with a breakfast nook that looked out over the pastures. A coffee maker gurgled on the counter, filling the room with rich, welcoming scents. The refrigerator was covered with the usual collection of bills, appointment reminders and business cards. But what caught Sarah's attention was a photo tucked among the utility notices. It showed Thomas with a blonde woman, both of them younger and laughing at something outside the frame. The woman had her hand on Thomas's chest, and he was looking at her like she was the center of his world. Sarah stared at the photo for a long moment, taking in the easy intimacy between the two people. The kind of connection that spoke of years together and plans for more years to come. She wondered what had happened to the blonde woman, though she suspected she already knew. The carefully neutral way Millie had spoken about Thomas living alone, the nursery guest room upstairs, the empty house that was too big for one person, they all pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had left him. The sound of boots on the back porch broke her from her thoughts. Thomas appeared at the kitchen door, stamping snow from his feet and pulling off work gloves that were stiff with cold. "Morning," he said, seeming unsurprised to find her up. "Coffee's fresh if you want some. Thank you." "I hope I didn't oversleep." Thomas glanced at the clock and raised an eyebrow. "It's not even 6. Most people would call this the middle of the night. I heard you leaving and figured I should get started too. I don't know what you need me to do, but I'm ready to work." Something shifted in his expression, approval maybe, or relief that she was taking the arrangement seriously. "Well, I usually grab something quick for breakfast and eat it on the road. The cattle in the far pasture need hay, and I want to check the water tanks before the temperature drops again." Sarah looked around the kitchen, taking inventory. "What if I made you a proper breakfast? Eggs, toast, maybe some of that bacon I saw in the fridge." "It wouldn't take long." Thomas paused in the act of reaching for what looked like a protein bar from the counter. "You don't have to." "I want to. Besides, you're going to be out in the cold for hours. You need real food." For a moment they stood looking at each other across the kitchen, and Sarah could see him wrestling with something, maybe the unfamiliarity of having someone care about whether he ate breakfast, maybe the simple strangeness of sharing his morning routine after 2 years of solitude. Finally, he nodded. "That would be nice. Thank you." While Sarah cooked, Thomas sat at the kitchen table going through mail and checking messages on his phone. It was companionable rather than awkward. the kind of easy silence that sometimes develops between people who don't need to fill every moment with conversation. "How many head do you run?" Sarah asked, cracking eggs into a bowl. "About 300 right now. Used to be more, but—" He trailed off, then seemed to change direction. "300's plenty for one person to manage." Sarah heard what he wasn't saying, that the ranch had once been planned for more than one person, that decisions made in a different life were still shaping this one. She scrambled the eggs and didn't push for details he wasn't ready to share. When she set the plate in front of him, eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns made from a potato she'd found in the pantry, Thomas stared at it like he'd forgotten what a home-cooked breakfast looked like. "This is incredible," he said after the first bite. "I haven't had anything like this since his wife left," Sarah thought, but again he didn't finish the sentence. "My mum taught me," she said instead. "She always said a good breakfast could fix most problems. Smart woman. Like your grandmother with the animals." Sarah smiled, pleased that he'd remembered such a small detail. They would have liked each other. After Thomas left for the morning chores, Sarah spent an hour exploring the house more thoroughly. The living room had built-in bookshelves, filled with an eclectic mix of ranch management guides, classic novels, and what looked like college textbooks from an agricultural program. Family photos covered the mantel, graduation pictures, wedding shots, and images of Thomas as a boy with an older couple who must have been his parents. The kitchen was well-equipped, but showed signs of a man cooking for one, a single plate in the dish drainer, leftovers in containers sized for individual meals, a spice rack that had clearly been assembled by someone who knew how to cook but didn't have anyone to cook for. Sarah began making a mental list of things she could do to make the house more livable for both of them. Groceries that would allow for proper meals, a thorough cleaning of rooms that had been maintained but not truly cared for, maybe some small touches that would make the place feel less like a museum and more like a home. She was making her own breakfast when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. Bakersfield. "Hello? Sarah, it's Miguel." Her brother's voice hit her like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, her free hand gripping the edge of the table. "Miguel, how did you get this number?" "Mom gave it to me. She got it from Father Miguel." There was a pause, filled with the sound of her brother trying not to cry. "Sarah, I miss you. When are you coming home?" The simple question nearly broke her heart. Miguel was only 16, caught in the middle of a family crisis he didn't fully understand. In his world, problems got solved and families stayed together, and his big sister coming home was just a matter of time. "I don't know if I am coming home, mijo," she said gently. "Things are complicated right now because of Dad, because of a lot of things. He's been different since you left, angrier. Mom cries when she thinks no one's looking, and he pretends not to notice. It's like half our family just disappeared." Sarah closed her eyes, imagining the house she'd grown up in, now fractured by her absence. She'd thought leaving would end the disappointment and anger, but instead it seemed to have just redirected it inward, poisoning everything that remained. "I'm sorry, Miguel. I'm so sorry you're dealing with this. Come home, Sarah, please. We can figure it out together." "I can't. Dad made it clear." "Dad's scared," Miguel interrupted, surprising her with his insight. "He worked so hard for your college money, and now he doesn't know what to do with it. Mom says he feels like he failed you somehow." Sarah's throat tightened. She'd been so focused on her father's anger that she hadn't considered the hurt underneath it, the sense that all his sacrifices had been for nothing. "I have a job now," she said finally. "A place to stay. I'm okay, Miguel." "Tell Mom I'm okay. What kind of job?" "Where are you?" Sarah looked around the kitchen, at the coffee mug Thomas had left in the sink, at the view of pastures stretching toward mountains she was still learning the names of. "I'm working on a ranch in Montana. The owner needed help with housekeeping, and it comes with room and board. It's good here, peaceful." "Montana? That's like 1,000 miles away." "I know. But sometimes you have to go far away to figure out who you're supposed to be. They talked for another 10 minutes. Miguel filling her in on school and friends, and the small details of a life that felt increasingly foreign to Sarah. When they finally hung up, she sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, wrestling with homesickness and guilt, and the growing certainty that this ranch in Montana was becoming more than just a temporary refuge. Thomas returned around noon, bringing with him the scent of cold air and hay, and something indefinably masculine that Sarah was beginning to associate with safety. He found her in the living room, dusting the bookshelves with a thoroughness that suggested she'd been working off nervous energy. "You don't have to clean everything in one day," he said, but his tone was amused rather than critical. "I needed to stay busy. Besides, this place deserves better than bachelor housekeeping," he laughed, the first real laugh she'd heard from him. Harsh, but fair. Sarah set down her dustcloth and turned to face him. "Thomas, can I ask you something?" His expression grew cautious. "Shoot, what happened to your wife?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah half expected him to shut down, to tell her it wasn't her business, to retreat behind the careful politeness he'd shown her so far. Instead, he sat down heavily in his leather armchair and scrubbed his hands over his face. "Rebecca left 2 years ago. We'd been trying to have kids for years, and when it became clear that wasn't going to happen," he shrugged, the gesture encompassing loss too large for words. "She said she needed to figure out who she was, if she wasn't going to be a mother. I couldn't argue with that. I'm sorry." "Me too." He looked at her directly then, his grey eyes holding a pain that matched her own. "What about you? The father of your baby, is he going to be involved?" "No." Sarah's hand moved to her belly. "He made it clear this isn't what he wants for his life, his loss." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, made Sarah's eyes burn with unexpected tears. When was the last time someone had looked at her pregnancy as something valuable rather than something shameful? "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people who understood something about abandonment, about having your life's plan torn up by circumstances beyond your control. "So," Thomas said finally, "how do you feel about learning to drive a truck?" Sarah blinked. "What? If you're going to be working here, you'll need to get around the ranch. The old Ford's got an automatic transmission, and it's not too big. I could teach you this afternoon if you're up for it." The offer represented more than just practical necessity. It was inclusion, investment in her staying, a vote of confidence in her ability to become part of this place. "I'd like that," she said, and as they prepared to head outside for her first driving lesson, Sarah realized that for the first time since she'd seen those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test, she was looking forward to tomorrow. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could build something new from the pieces of her old life. The baby kicked, strong and sure, as if it approved of this new direction. Sarah smiled and followed Thomas toward the door, ready to learn how to navigate this unfamiliar world that was starting to feel like it might become home. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Sarah had settled into a rhythm at the Brennan Ranch that felt surprisingly natural. She woke before dawn to make Thomas's breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house, and her afternoons learning the basics of ranch life. Thomas had been patient, teaching her to drive the old Ford, showing her how to check on cattle, even explaining the complicated dance of moving herds between pastures. But it was the evenings Sarah treasured most. After the day's work was done and dinner was finished, they'd sit in the living room, Thomas reading ranch journals, while Sarah worked on baby clothes she was learning to knit from YouTube tutorials. Sometimes they talked about small things, the weather, the cattle, plans for fixing the fence in the south pasture. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, just 2 people who no longer had to face the night alone. Sarah's belly had grown noticeably in those 3 weeks, making her pregnancy impossible to hide. Thomas never mentioned it directly, but she caught him looking sometimes, and there was something in his expression that made her heart ache for him. He would have been a wonderful father. On this particular Tuesday morning in December, Sarah was in the kitchen making pancakes when she heard the rumble of an unfamiliar truck coming up the driveway. Through the window, she could see a white pickup with government plates pulling to a stop near the front porch. Thomas emerged from the barn, his posture instantly tense as a woman in a dark coat got out of the vehicle. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the official bearing, the clipboard in the woman's hands, the kind of purposeful stride that meant trouble. Sarah's blood went cold as understanding hit her. Child Protective Services. Someone had reported a pregnant teenager living with a single man, and now the state was here to investigate. The woman was already on the porch by the time Sarah reached the front door. She was middle-aged, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's failures to be easily fooled. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Janet Morrison from Child and Family Services. I'd like to speak with you about Sarah Martinez." Thomas's jaw tightened, but his voice remained carefully neutral. "May I ask who reported her?" "I'm afraid that information is confidential. May I come in?" Sarah stepped into view, her hand instinctively protective over her belly.
I'm Sarah Martinez. Janet Morrison's gaze swept over her.
Taking in the obvious pregnancy, the comfortable domesticity of the scene, the way Thomas positioned himself slightly between Sarah and potential threat. "Miss Martinez, I understand you're 19 years old and approximately 6 months pregnant. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you're living here with Mr. Brennan, who is not the father of your child and not a relative?" "That's correct." Sarah's voice stayed steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Janet made notes on her clipboard. "I'd like to speak with each of you separately, and I'll need to inspect the living conditions. This is a routine investigation to ensure the safety and welfare of both you and your unborn child." The next 2 hours were the longest of Sarah's life. Janet interviewed her first, asking detailed questions about her relationship with Thomas, their living arrangements, how she'd ended up in Montana. Sarah answered honestly, explaining about her family situation, the job arrangement, the separate bedrooms, Thomas's respectful treatment of her. "Has Mr. Brennan ever made you feel uncomfortable or unsafe in any way?" Janet asked. "Never. He's been nothing but kind and respectful." "And your family situation? Your parents know where you are?" Sarah hesitated. "My mother does. My father and I. We had a disagreement about my pregnancy." Janet's expression softened slightly. "I see. And you feel this is the best environment for you right now?" "I do. Thomas, Mr. Brennan, has given me a safe place to live and work while I figure out my future. I don't know what I would have done without his help." After Janet interviewed Thomas, she did a thorough inspection of the house, checking Sarah's bedroom, the kitchen facilities, the general safety of the environment. Sarah watched from the living room, her heart pounding, imagining being forced to leave this place that had become home. Finally, Janet sat down with both of them in the living room. Her expression was unreadable as she reviewed her notes. "I'll be frank with you both," she said. "When I got the report about this situation, I was expecting to find something very different. An older man taking advantage of a vulnerable pregnant girl, unsafe living conditions, exploitation of some kind." Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her. "However," Janet continued, "what I've found is a young woman who appears to be thriving in a safe, supportive environment, and a man who seems genuinely committed to her welfare with no expectation of anything inappropriate in return." Relief flooded through Sarah so suddenly she felt dizzy. "That said," Janet added, raising a hand, "there are some concerns I need to address. Miss Martinez, you're still a minor in some legal contexts, and you're in a vulnerable position. Mr. Brennan, while I believe your intentions are good, you're in a position of significant power over someone who has limited options." Thomas leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" "First, I want Miss Martinez to have regular check-ins with a social worker. That would be me, to ensure her continued safety and well-being. Second, I want documentation of the employment arrangement, with clear boundaries and expectations. Third, Miss Martinez needs to be connected with prenatal care and other support services. I've been trying to find a doctor, Sarah said quickly. But without insurance, I can help with that. There are programs available for pregnant women in your situation. Janet looked between them. I'm also going to recommend that you both consider legal consultation to formalize your arrangement and protect both of your interests. After Janet left with promises to return in 2 weeks, Sarah and Thomas sat in stunned silence. The comfortable routine they'd built suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. "Who do you think reported us?" Sarah asked finally. Thomas shook his head. "Could have been anyone. Small towns talk, and we haven't exactly been subtle about the arrangement." Sarah thought about the looks they'd gotten at the grocery store, the way conversations stopped when they walked into the post office together. She'd assumed it was just curiosity, but maybe some of that attention had been more judgmental than she'd realized. "Thomas, if this is too complicated for you, I understand. I never meant to bring trouble into your life." He turned to look at her, his grey eyes fierce with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. You are not trouble. You are not a burden. And I am not letting some busybody with too much time on their hands drive you away from the first place you felt safe." The intensity in his voice surprised her. In the 3 weeks they'd lived together, Thomas had been kind, respectful, generous, but this was different. This was protective in a way that went beyond employer to employee, beyond host to guest. But what if they keep investigating? What if they decide this isn't appropriate? Then we'll deal with it. Together. He stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over the pastures. "I've lost too much already, Sarah. I'm not losing this too." The word "this," whatever it encompassed, hung in the air between them. Charged with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, she found herself moving differently through the kitchen, hyper-aware that their peaceful domestic routine was no longer private. Someone was watching, judging, ready to tear apart the fragile stability they'd built together. The baby kicked strongly, as if sensing her distress, and Sarah placed both hands on her belly. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're going to be okay." But even as she said the words, she wondered if she was lying. How many times had her life been upended just when she thought she'd found solid ground? How many times could a person start over before they ran out of strength to rebuild? Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, freshly showered and changed from his work clothes. "Need help with anything?" Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice. The casual intimacy of the question, the assumption that they were a team, that her burdens were shared, made her throat tight with emotion. "Sarah." His voice was gentle. "Talk to me." She set down the wooden spoon she'd been stirring with and turned to face him. "I'm scared, Thomas. I'm scared that just when I thought I'd found somewhere to belong, it's going to get taken away." He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, and for a moment Sarah thought he might embrace her. Instead, he stopped just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I made you a promise the night I brought you here," he said quietly. "I told you that you weren't alone anymore. That promise doesn't expire because some social worker shows up with a clipboard. But what if they force me to leave? What if they decide this arrangement is inappropriate or unsafe? Then we'll prove them wrong. We'll document everything, follow every rule, jump through every hoop they require. And if that's not enough," he paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "If that's not enough, then we'll find another way." Sarah searched his face, looking for doubt or resentment or any sign that he was reconsidering the complications she'd brought into his orderly life. She found none of those things. Instead, she saw determination and something that looked almost like tenderness. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you willing to fight for this, for me?" Thomas was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with honesty. "Because for the first time in 2 years, this house feels like a home instead of a museum. Because you've reminded me what it feels like to have someone to take care of, someone who needs me. Because that baby you're carrying deserves to be born into love instead of chaos. He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. And because I think maybe we're saving each other. The words hit Sarah like a physical force, not just because of what they revealed about his feelings, but because they spoke to the truth she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. She wasn't just grateful for Thomas's help. She was beginning to love this life they'd built together, this quiet partnership that had grown from necessity into something deeper. "Thomas," she whispered, "I know it's complicated," he said quickly. "I know there are a dozen reasons why this is all kinds of wrong. You're 19. You're pregnant with another man's child. You're in a vulnerable position, and I'm a 33-year-old man who probably should know better." "But," Sarah prompted, "but I can't bring myself to care about any of that when I see how you light up this house. When I watch you taking care of things that have been neglected for too long. When I think about you having to face all of this alone." Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it, not just safety or shelter, but the feeling of being genuinely wanted, genuinely valued for who she was rather than who someone needed her to be. "I don't want to face it alone either," she admitted. They stood looking at each other across the kitchen, the air between them electric with possibility and danger. Both of them knew they were standing at a crossroads. They could keep pretending this was just a practical arrangement, or they could acknowledge that something real was growing between them, something worth fighting for. The timer on the oven chose that moment to beep, breaking the spell. Sarah turned to check the casserole, using the movement to compose herself, to step back from the edge of whatever cliff they'd been approaching. But as they sat down to dinner that night, sharing details of their day like any couple might, Sarah felt something shift in the house around them. The walls seemed to breathe easier, as if the building itself approved of the honesty they'd finally spoken aloud. Outside, winter continued to tighten its grip on the Montana landscape. But inside the ranch house, two people who had thought their chances for happiness were behind them were discovering that sometimes the most unexpected love stories were also the most necessary ones. They still had battles to fight, scrutiny to endure, and a future to figure out. But they would face all of it together, and that made even the approaching storm feel manageable. After all, they'd both survived worse things than busybodies and government inspections. They'd survived abandonment and rejection, and the death of dreams they'd thought they couldn't live without. They could survive anything, as long as they didn't have to survive it alone. The law office of Henderson and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building that had probably been elegant in the 1920s, but now showed its age in cracked mortar and paint that needed refreshing. Sarah climbed the narrow stairs carefully, her hand trailing along the worn banister while Thomas followed behind, ready to steady her if needed. At 26 weeks pregnant, she was beginning to feel the weight of the baby in ways that made simple tasks more challenging. But today's appointment was too important to postpone, even if it meant navigating steep staircases and uncomfortable chairs. Janet Morrison had been true to her word about helping them formalize their arrangement. She'd recommended David Henderson, a family law attorney who specialized in unconventional living situations, and had even helped Sarah apply for Medicaid to cover her prenatal care. The office itself was cluttered but organized, with law books covering every available wall and a desk that suggested its owner actually worked at it rather than just posed behind it. David Henderson looked to be in his 50s, with the kind of rumpled appearance that spoke of long hours and too much coffee. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Brennan," he said, gesturing to chairs across from his desk. "Janet Morrison filled me in on your situation. Interesting case, not something we see every day." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "What exactly do we need to do to protect Sarah?" "Well, the first step is formalizing the employment relationship. We'll draw up a contract that clearly outlines duties, compensation, living arrangements, and boundaries. This protects both of you legally and gives child services the documentation they're looking for. Henderson pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Sarah, you're currently earning how much? $500 a week plus room and board, Sarah answered. Henderson nodded approvingly. That's actually quite generous for housekeeping in this area. Thomas, you're providing full room and board, including utilities, food, everything. Yes, she has her own bedroom and bathroom, complete privacy. The arrangement is strictly professional. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the emphasis on professional, though she understood why Thomas needed to stress that point. The truth was more complicated than either of them was ready to discuss with a lawyer, but the legal reality had to be clear-cut. Good. Now, Sarah, what about after the baby is born? Have you thought about your long-term plans? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had been trying not to think too far ahead, focusing on getting through each day, each week, each milestone. But at some point, she'd have to make decisions about her future and her child's future. I don't know, she admitted. I'd like to go back to school eventually, but with a baby. There are programs, Henderson said gently. Community college courses, online degrees, vocational training. Janet mentioned you were accepted to UC Berkeley. I was. But that was before. Sarah gestured to her belly. Before doesn't mean never, Thomas said quietly. We could figure something out. Sarah looked at him in surprise. They'd never discussed her going back to school, and she'd assumed that dream was permanently shelved. Let's focus on the immediate future for now, Henderson continued. Sarah, do you want Thomas to have any legal standing in relation to the baby? Guardianship rights, emergency medical decisions, anything like that? The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd been thinking of Thomas as her employer, her protector, her friend. But did she want him to have legal rights regarding her child? I'm not sure. What would that mean exactly? Well, if something happened to you during delivery or afterward, Thomas would have the legal authority to make decisions for the baby. It's something to consider, especially since you don't have family support locally. Sarah felt a chill at the thought of something happening to her, leaving her baby completely alone in the world. Her parents had disowned her. Marcus wanted nothing to do with the child, and she had no other relatives who would step up. I'd like to think about that, she said. Of course. There's no rush on that decision. Henderson made more notes. Now let's talk about the living situation. Thomas, the house is owned outright? Yes. Been in my family for 4 generations. Good. Sarah, you're comfortable with the current arrangement? Separate quarters, clear boundaries, no concerns about safety or propriety? None at all. Thomas has been nothing but respectful and kind. Henderson spent another hour going through details, explaining their options, outlining the legal protections they could put in place. By the time they left his office, Sarah's head was spinning with information about employment contracts, guardianship papers, and something called a co-parenting agreement that they weren't ready to discuss yet. How are you feeling? Thomas asked as they walked to his truck. Overwhelmed. I never thought I'd need a lawyer at 19. Most 19-year-olds don't, but then most 19-year-olds aren't as brave as you are. Sarah looked at him sharply. Brave! I've made nothing but mistakes. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Sarah, you've been thrown out by your family, abandoned by the father of your baby, and forced to start over in a place where you knew no one. And instead of giving up, you've worked harder than anyone I know to build something better. That's not mistakes, that's courage. His words hit her with unexpected force. She'd been so focused on her failures, the pregnancy that derailed her plans, the disappointment she'd caused her parents, the choices that led her to depend on the kindness of strangers, that she'd never considered her response to those setbacks might be something to be proud of. I don't feel brave, she said softly. The bravest people usually don't. That afternoon, while Thomas worked on repairing fence lines damaged by the early winter storms, Sarah had her first prenatal appointment at the community health clinic. Dr. Patricia Wells was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who treated Sarah with the kind of professional kindness that didn't judge or pry into situations she hadn't been asked. "About baby looks good," Dr. Wells announced, moving the ultrasound wand across Sarah's gel-covered belly. "Growth is right on track, heartbeat strong. Any questions about what you're seeing here?" Sarah stared at the black and white image on the monitor, trying to make sense of the shapes and shadows. Then suddenly she could see it, a profile, the curve of a tiny nose, what might have been a thumb near a small mouth. "Is that—" she whispered. "That's your baby's face," Dr. Wells confirmed. "And if you look here, you can see the spine, and here are the arms and legs. Everything looks perfectly normal." For the first time since she'd discovered she was pregnant, Sarah felt a surge of pure, uncomplicated joy. This wasn't just an abstract concept anymore, not just a problem to solve or a source of shame to hide. This was her child, real and healthy and growing inside her. "Would you like to know the sex?" Dr. Wells asked. Sarah hesitated. Knowing would make it even more real, would force her to start thinking about names and futures and all the practical details she'd been avoiding. "Yes," she said finally, "it's a girl, a daughter." Sarah was going to have a daughter. She drove back to the ranch in a daze, her mind spinning with the reality of what she'd seen and learned. A little girl who would need clothes and toys and a bedroom of her own. A daughter who would ask questions about her father, about her grandparents, about why their family looked different from other families. Thomas was waiting on the front porch when she pulled up, clearly having watched for her return. The concerned look on his face told her he'd been worried about how the appointment would go. "Everything okay?" he called as she got out of the truck. "Everything's fine." "Better than fine." Sarah pulled the ultrasound photos from her purse, her hands shaking slightly with excitement. "Thomas, look at this." He took the photos carefully, studying them with the same intensity he brought to examining cattle or checking fence lines. Sarah watched his face change as understanding dawned, saw the wonder replace concern. "That's incredible," he said softly. "You can actually see her face. It's a girl." Thomas looked up sharply. "A girl? A little girl who's going to need so many things I don't know how to provide, who's going to ask questions I don't know how to answer, who deserves better than a teenage mother who doesn't even have her own family anymore." The words tumbled out before Sarah could stop them, all her fears and doubts spilling over now that the baby had become undeniably real. Thomas set the photos down carefully and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sarah, can I tell you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I've spent the last 2 years thinking my chance to be part of a family was over. That the closest I'd ever come to having children was the nursery upstairs that never got used. But these past few weeks, watching you make this house into a home, imagining a little girl running through these rooms." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I know this isn't the way either of us planned it, but maybe that's okay. Maybe the best families aren't always the ones you plan." Sarah felt tears starting, the emotional overwhelm of the day finally catching up with her. "Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your daughter's life. Not as a replacement for her biological father, but as someone who chooses to love her. Someone who wants to be there for all the questions and the scraped knees and the first days of school." The offer was so much more than Sarah had dared to hope for, so far beyond anything she thought she deserved. Here was a man willing to choose her broken, complicated situation and call it family. "Thomas, She struggled to find words adequate to the moment. Yes, I want that too." He smiled then, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face, and Sarah realized she was looking at the father her daughter would know. Not the man who had contributed DNA, but the man who was choosing to show up, to stay, to love them both regardless of biology. That evening, they sat in the living room with the ultrasound photos spread across the coffee table, discussing practical things like converting the spare bedroom into a proper nursery and what kind of crib to buy. But underneath the mundane planning was a current of something much deeper, the recognition that they were no longer just two lonely people helping each other survive, but a family choosing itself into existence. "Have you thought about names?" Thomas asked. Sarah shook her head. I was too scared to think that far ahead. Well, we have time. And now we have a reason to start planning. The word "we" settled over Sarah like a warm blanket. For the first time since she'd seen those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test, she wasn't facing the future alone. She had a partner, a home, and a man who was already loving her daughter before she was even born. Outside, the Montana winter continued its relentless grip on the landscape. But inside the ranch house, a new kind of warmth was taking root. The warmth of chosen family, of love that transcended biology, of hope that had survived every attempt to crush it. Sarah's daughter would be born into love after all. It might not look like the traditional family Sarah had once imagined, but it would be real and strong and absolutely hers. And for the first time in months, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. January in Montana was unforgiving, with temperatures that made going outside feel like stepping into a freezer and snow that piled higher each week. Sarah was now 30 weeks pregnant, moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo. Her belly round and prominent beneath the maternity clothes Thomas had quietly ordered online, without being asked. The nursery was coming together beautifully. They'd painted the walls a soft mint green, and Thomas had spent weekends assembling a crib, changing table and rocking chair that would arrive in pieces and required more patience than either of them possessed. But somehow, between Sarah's Pinterest research and Thomas's determination to follow instructions exactly, the room was transforming into something magical. Sarah was arranging tiny clothes in the dresser drawers when she heard the sound that had become familiar over the past month. Another vehicle coming up the long driveway. Janet Morrison had been making her scheduled visits, always professional but increasingly warm, as she saw how well the arrangement was working. The local pastor had stopped by after hearing about their situation through the small-town grapevine, offering support rather than judgment, but this engine sounded different, heavier, less familiar. Sarah looked out the nursery window and felt her heart stop. A battered pickup truck with California plates was pulling to a stop in front of the house. As she watched, 2 figures got out. A short, stocky man with graying hair and a smaller woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her parents. Thomas, Sarah called, her voice cracking with panic. She heard his boots on the stairs immediately, taking them 2 at a time. What's wrong? He appeared in the nursery doorway, saw her face, and immediately moved to the window. His expression darkened as he took in the scene below. Do you want me to tell them to leave? Sarah's mind raced. How had they found her? What did they want? And why now, when she was finally beginning to believe in the life she was building? I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know what to do. The sound of footsteps on the porch decided for her. Thomas squeezed her shoulder gently. Whatever happens, we'll handle it together. You're not the same girl who left Bakersfield, Sarah. You're stronger now. The knock came firm and authoritative, her father's knock. Sarah made her way downstairs slowly, Thomas beside her, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the front window, she could see her mother clutching a worn purse, her father standing slightly behind her with the rigid posture that meant he was preparing for a difficult conversation. Sarah opened the door. Hello? Papa, Mama. Roberto Martinez looked older than she remembered. His hair grayer, new lines etched around his eyes. But it was her mother who broke Sarah's heart. Maria looked smaller somehow, diminished by months of worry and grief. Misha, Maria whispered, her eyes immediately going to Sarah's prominent belly, then to her face, then back to the clear evidence of how far along the pregnancy was. How did you find me? Sarah asked. Roberto's jaw tightened. Your brother. He's been talking to you, hasn't he? When he said Montana Ranch, it wasn't hard to track down. Behind Sarah, Thomas stepped forward slightly. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez? I'm Thomas Brennan. Would you like to come inside? It's cold out there, Roberto's eyes fixed on Thomas with undisguised suspicion. You're the man who's been harboring our daughter. I'm the man who gave your daughter a job and a safe place to live when she needed both. Thomas replied evenly. The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut. Sarah could see neighbors in the distance slowing their trucks to get a better look at the drama unfolding at the Brennan place. "Please," Sarah said, "come inside. We can talk properly." The living room had never felt smaller than it did with all four of them, sitting in careful formation. Sarah and Thomas on the couch, her parents in the armchairs across from them. Maria kept staring at Sarah as if trying to reconcile this confident, glowing woman with the frightened girl who had left home in November. "You look good, Mija," Maria said finally. "Healthy. I am healthy, Mama. The baby is healthy too." Roberto leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Sarah, we've come to bring you home." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her. "Home," Sarah repeated. "Your room is exactly as you left it," Maria said quickly. "We've been saving money for the baby, buying things. A crib, clothes, bottles. Everything she'll need. She?" Sarah's eyes widened. "How did you—" Miguel told us. "He's been worried sick about you, calling when your father isn't around." Maria's voice cracked slightly. "We all have been worried." Roberto stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small space. "This is no place for my daughter to have a baby. Living with a strange man, isolated from family, from everything she knows." "With respect, Mr. Martinez," Thomas said carefully, "Sarah isn't isolated. She has friends here, medical care, a support system." "Support system?" Roberto's voice rose. "You mean you? A man she's known for what, 2 months? What kind of support is that for a woman having a baby?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Papa, Thomas has been kinder to me than anyone else was when I needed help. He didn't judge me or throw me out or make me feel like I'd ruined everything good in the world. The barb hit its target." Roberto's face flushed, but before he could respond, Maria leaned forward. "Mija, we know we made mistakes. Your father especially. He was angry and scared and said things he didn't mean." "Didn't mean?" Sarah's voice was incredulous. "He told me to get out and never come back. He said I'd thrown my life away." Roberto stopped pacing, his back to them. When he turned around, Sarah was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I was so angry at the situation, at that boy who abandoned you, at the college dreams that seemed ruined, that I took it out on you. But you're my daughter, Sarah. You'll always be my daughter." The words Sarah had been longing to hear for months hit her like a physical blow. But instead of relief, she felt a complex tangle of emotions, hurt, anger, love, and something that might have been forgiveness, but wasn't quite ready to bloom. "So you want me to come home now? Now that it's convenient? Now that you've decided I'm not completely worthless?" "That's not," Roberto started, "because I have a life here. Papa, I have work I enjoy, a home where I'm respected, people who chose to care about me when my own family wouldn't." Maria was crying now, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "We never stopped caring about you, Mija. Never. Your father was hurting, but we never stopped loving you." Thomas had been silent through this exchange, but now he spoke up. "Mr. Martinez, Mrs. Martinez, I understand this is difficult, but Sarah is an adult making her own decisions. If she wants to go back to California, I won't stand in her way. But she's built a good life here." "What kind of life?" Roberto demanded. "Playing house with a stranger? What happens when he gets tired of supporting someone else's child? What happens when he meets a woman who can give him his own family?" The question hit closer to home than Sarah wanted to admit. They were concerns she'd had herself in the dark hours of early morning, when pregnancy insomnia kept her awake. What was she to Thomas, really? A project? A temporary solution to his loneliness? But Thomas's response was immediate and unwavering. "Mr. Martinez, I understand your concerns, but I need you to understand something. I'm not supporting someone else's child. I'm supporting Sarah and her daughter, who I already consider part of my family. Not because I have to, but because I choose to." He turned to look at Sarah, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "I love your daughter, sir. And I love the baby she's carrying, not out of pity or obligation, but because they've brought light back into a house that had been dark for too long. The declaration hung in the suddenly silent room. Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. They'd talked around their feelings, hinted at deeper connection, but Thomas had never said the words so directly, so publicly, so irrevocably. Maria was the first to speak. "Mia, is this true? Do you love him too?" Sarah looked at Thomas, at this man who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had shared his home and his dreams and his hope for the future, who had just declared his love in front of her parents without hesitation or embarrassment. "Yes, Mama, I love him too." Roberto sank back into his chair as if the fight had gone out of him. "This is not how I imagined my daughter's life would go. None of us imagined it would go this way. But that doesn't make it wrong." They talked for another hour, the conversation gradually shifting from confrontation to something that resembled negotiation. Roberto struggled with the unconventional nature of Sarah's situation, but even he could see the obvious care between Sarah and Thomas, the way the house felt like a real home, the evidence of careful preparation for the baby's arrival. Maria was easier to win over, especially when Sarah showed her the nursery they'd prepared and the ultrasound photos that proved her granddaughter was thriving. "She has your nose," Maria said, studying the latest photo, "and the Martinez chin. She's going to be beautiful," Thomas said quietly. "Just like her mother." By the time her parents prepared to leave, something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamic. It wasn't complete reconciliation. There were still wounds that needed time to heal, still adjustments to be made to expectations and dreams. But it was a beginning. "We'd like to stay for the birth," Maria said as they gathered their coats. "If that's all right with you." Sarah looked at Thomas, who nodded immediately. "Of course, Mama, I'd like that." Roberto shook Thomas's hand, the gesture formal but genuine. "Take care of my girls." "Always," Thomas replied. After her parents left for their motel in town, Sarah and Thomas sat in the living room, processing what had just happened. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked. Sarah considered the question. Her family had found her, confronted her, and ultimately begun to accept the life she'd chosen. Thomas had declared his love in front of her parents. Everything felt different, more real, more permanent. "I think so. It's a lot to take in. I'm sorry I sprung that on you, telling them I love you. I probably should have said it to you first." Sarah turned to face him fully.
"Thomas, yeah."
"I love you too. I've been afraid to say it, afraid to believe it could be real, but I do. I love you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that tasted like promises and new beginnings. When they broke apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we finish getting ready for our daughter to arrive. We figure out how to blend your family back into your life. We plan a future together that includes all the people who love you, all of them." Thomas smiled. "Well, maybe not the baby's biological father. But everyone else who matters? Yeah, all of them." As they sat together in the quiet house, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since she was a child: the absolute security of being completely, unconditionally loved, not despite her mistakes and complications, but including them, encompassing them, making them part of a story that was still being written. Her daughter would be born into this love, this chosen family that had grown from two broken people into something whole and strong and unshakable. And for the first time since this entire journey began, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that everything was going to be all right. The contractions started at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, pulling Sarah from sleep with the intensity that made her gasp. For a moment she lay still in the dark, wondering if she'd imagined it. Then another wave hit, stronger than the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. And she knew today was the day she would meet her daughter. "Thomas," she called softly, not wanting to panic, but needing him to know. His response was immediate. He'd been sleeping lightly for weeks, alert to any sign that labor might be starting. "Is it time?" His voice was calm but alert as he appeared in her doorway, already pulling on jeans and a shirt. "I think so." "They're about 8 minutes apart," Thomas nodded, switching into the organized mode they'd practiced. "I'll call Dr. Wells and your parents. You get dressed and grab the hospital." The next few hours passed in a blur of controlled activity. Dr. Wells confirmed over the phone that Sarah should head to the hospital when contractions reached 5 minutes apart. Roberto and Maria arrived from their motel looking nervous but determined to be helpful. Thomas loaded the truck with practiced efficiency while Sarah breathed through increasingly intense contractions. "You're doing great." "Mija," Maria said, rubbing Sarah's back as another contraction peaked. "Just like I did with you and Miguel. Women are stronger than we know." The drive to the hospital in Billings took 45 minutes that felt like hours. Thomas drove with steady concentration while Maria sat in the back seat with Sarah, timing contractions and murmuring encouragement in Spanish. Roberto followed in his own truck, looking like a man preparing for battle. The maternity ward at Billings General was quiet in the pre-dawn hours, but the staff moved with efficient calm as they got Sarah settled in a labor and delivery room. Dr. Wells arrived within the hour, examining Sarah with professional thoroughness. "You're at 6 centimeters, she announced. "This baby is definitely coming today, probably within the next few hours." The next phase of labor was harder than anything Sarah had imagined. Despite all the books she'd read and classes she'd attended, nothing had truly prepared her for the overwhelming intensity of bringing a person into the world. But she wasn't facing it alone. Thomas never left her side, holding her hand through contractions, wiping her face with cool washcloths, murmuring words of encouragement when the pain made her want to give up. Her mother moved around the room with quiet efficiency, adjusting pillows and keeping ice chips available. Even Roberto, despite his obvious discomfort with the medical setting, stayed close, ready to help however he could. "I can't do this," Sarah gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. "Yes, you can," Thomas said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know, Sarah. You've survived everything life has thrown at you, and you're going to do this too." "He's right, Mija," Maria added. "You carried this baby all these months, loved her before you even met her. You can bring her safely into the world." At 2:47 p.m., after 12 hours of labor, Isabella Maria Brennan made her entrance into the world with a cry that seemed impossibly loud for someone who weighed only 6 pounds, 4 ounces. "She's perfect," Dr. Wells announced, placing the tiny, red-faced baby on Sarah's chest. "Absolutely perfect," Sarah looked down at her daughter, this little person she'd carried and worried about and loved from the moment she knew she existed, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. Isabella had dark hair that stuck up at crazy angles, tiny fists that waved indignantly at the bright lights, and when she opened her eyes, they were the same dark brown as Sarah's. "Hello, baby girl," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've been waiting so long to meet you." Thomas stood beside the bed, his own eyes wet with tears, as he looked at the baby who would be his daughter in every way that mattered. When Sarah looked up at him, she saw wonder and love, and something that looked like completion. "Would you like to hold her?" Sarah asked. Thomas took Isabella with the careful reverence of a man handling the most precious thing in the world. The baby settled immediately into his arms, as if she recognized the voice that had been talking to her through Sarah's belly for months. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's absolutely beautiful." Maria and Roberto crowded closer, their own eyes shining as they got their first look at their granddaughter. "She has the Martinez nose," Maria announced with satisfaction. "And look at those little fingers, so perfect." Roberto, who had been mostly silent throughout the labor, reached out tentatively to touch one of Isabella's tiny hands. When her fingers instinctively curled around his face crumpled with emotion. "My granddaughter," he said wonderfully. "My beautiful granddaughter." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Pediatric examinations, paperwork, visiting hours, and the steady stream of people who wanted to welcome Isabella into the world. Janet Morrison stopped by with congratulations and a beautiful baby blanket. Millie from the diner arrived with enough food to feed the entire maternity ward. Even David Henderson, their lawyer, sent flowers and a card promising to expedite the legal documents that would make Thomas Isabella's legal father. But it was the quiet moments that Sarah treasured. Most, Thomas holding Isabella while she slept, her parents taking turns rocking their granddaughter, the peaceful silence of new love settling over their expanded family. On their second day in the hospital, Sarah woke from a nap to find Thomas sitting in the chair beside her bed, Isabella sleeping peacefully in his arms while he read to her from a book of children's poetry. Starting her education early, Sarah asked with a smile. Thomas looked up, his face lighting up at seeing her awake. Figured it couldn't hurt. Besides, she seems to like the sound of my voice. Sarah studied them together, this man who had chosen to love them both, who had transformed from a lonely rancher into a devoted father, without missing a beat. Thomas, I need to ask you something. Anything. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything. Will you marry me? Thomas stared at her, clearly not expecting the question. Sarah, I know it's unconventional for the woman to propose, and I know we've done everything backwards, but I can't imagine my life without you in it. I can't imagine Isabella growing up without you as her father. Not just her caretaker or her mother's boyfriend, but her real father. Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry she'd overstepped, pushed too hard too fast. Finally he spoke. Sarah Martinez, I have been in love with you since the night I found you in Millie's diner, and I've been dreaming about this moment since the day you told me you were having a daughter. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I want to be Isabella's father. Yes, I want us to be a real family. He leaned over carefully, mindful of the baby in his arms, and kissed Sarah with all the tenderness and promise of a man committing to forever. When? Sarah asked when they broke apart. As soon as you're ready. Tomorrow, next month, next year, whenever you want. As long as it's soon. They decided on a spring wedding. Something simple and beautiful at the ranch with family and the few friends who had become so important to their story. Isabella would be old enough to be part of the ceremony, and Sarah would have time to recover from childbirth and adjust to motherhood. 3 months later, on the perfect May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the Montana pastures, Sarah walked down the aisle they'd created in the ranch house's backyard. She wore a simple white dress that accommodated her post-pregnancy body, and she carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers that dotted the landscape around them. Thomas waited at the makeshift altar they'd constructed near the old oak tree, wearing a suit that transformed him from rancher to groom, but couldn't hide the joy radiating from his face. Isabella, now 3 months old and the center of everyone's attention, slept peacefully in Maria's arms in the front row. Dearly beloved, the pastor began, but Sarah barely heard the words. She was focused on Thomas's face, on the promise in his eyes, on the absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. When they exchanged vows, they'd written themselves. There wasn't a dry eye among their small gathering of family and friends. Sarah, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. You came into my life when I thought my story was over. You brought love and laughter and hope back into a house that had forgotten what family sounded like. I promise to love you and Isabella with everything I have for as long as I live. Sarah's voice was thick with tears as she responded. Thomas, you saved us when we had nowhere else to go. You chose to love us when the world had written us off. I promise to build a life with you that's worthy of the chance you gave us. To love you with the same generosity you've shown us. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer from their small audience could probably be heard across the county. But Sarah only had eyes for her new husband, for the man who had kept every promise he'd ever made to her. Later, as the reception wound down and Isabella dozed in her portable crib, Sarah and Thomas stood on their front porch, looking out over the land that was now officially theirs together. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, his arm around her waist. Sarah thought about the question seriously. The path that had brought her here hadn't been easy. Family rejection, abandonment, poverty, uncertainty, the fear that she'd never find a place to belong. But every difficult step had led her to this moment, to this man, to this life that was more beautiful than anything she could have planned. "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one." In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that would one day belong to Isabella. The house behind them was filled with the sounds of family, her parents helping with cleanup, the laughter of people who had chosen each other across bloodlines and circumstances. 5 years later, Sarah would graduate from the University of Montana with a degree in agricultural business, studying online while raising Isabella and helping Thomas expand the ranch. Isabella would grow up bilingual, confident, surrounded by love from grandparents who adored her and parents who had chosen each other against all odds. The ranch would prosper under their joint management, becoming known throughout the region for its sustainable practices and strong community connections. Sarah would establish a program helping other young mothers in difficult situations, offering them the same kind of second chance she'd received. But all of that was still in the future. Tonight, Sarah Brennan stood in her husband's arms on the porch of their home, listening to their daughter's soft breathing from inside the house, watching the sun set over land that would be their legacy. She'd left California as a frightened teenager with nothing but a bus ticket and a prayer. She'd found Thomas Brennan at the lowest point of her life, when hope seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. Now she was wife, mother, partner, and owner of 5,000 acres of Montana sky. She was part of a love story that proved families could be chosen, that home could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the best endings began with what looked like the worst mistakes. The baby kicked gently in her sleep, and Sarah smiled. Isabella would grow up knowing she was wanted, loved, and cherished by parents who had fought for the right to call themselves a family. And in a world that often seemed determined to tear people apart, that felt like the most beautiful victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.